On the banks o' the Irvine, neath Loudoun's sweet braes, in a land that's aft sung o' in lilts and in lays, there nestles secure neath the shade o' the hills, that small little wee country toon o' Newmilns. Mang singers it's famed as a place full o' mirth, and some hae acclaimed it the hub o' the earth, while other toons slumber in ignorant nicht. This place is the toon baith o' Loudoun and licht. It thrives on the unceasing rattle o' looms. Its lassies hae faces as braw as their goons. Its sons can be met wi' where'er ye may gang, in the haunts o' the busy, be it near, be it lang. Sae though we are pairted and miles lie atween, with the day's bustle hour we can sit doon a teen, and think, as we ponder life's joys and its ills, o' that small little wee country toon o' Newmilns. Running along the river at the narrowest part of the Irvine Valley, Newmilns is the oldest inland borough in Ayrshire and was an important small industrial town for many years. Growing up where the Irvine water could easily be forded, the corn mills on the river bank gave the town its name. It is only very recently that the evidence for the town's name disappeared, with the closure and destruction of the last two meal mills. For 300 years, from 1593, the corn mill of Newmilns, known latterly as Loudoun Mill, remained in the same family. It stopped producing meal in the 1960s. The dam was used as an exercise in demolition by the British Army. Sadly, the mill wheel was removed in 1970 and the lade was filled in. The mill was converted to private housing. The miller's house and adjoining cottages, however, still retain the outward appearance they have shown for many years. As the lade continued its course westwards to rejoin the river where the railway viaduct crosses, it powered the 18th century mill or wool mill at Persian Sands. This later became a Madras mill and water power proved inadequate. A drive wheel was run underground from the steam engine in Wilson's mill across the road. The final meal mill to go was demolished in 1977. The lead to operate the mill ran from the Miller's Dam, which was washed away in the 1920 flood. It crossed Brown's Road and ran behind the houses in Brown Street. It then turned right at the station Bray to cross Brown Street. The mill stood on the corner of North Devon Place, now part of Nelson Street. It was made famous by Alan Ramsay in his song, The Lass o' Patie's Mill. There is nothing left of the mill, not even a commemorative plaque. On its way, the Lade operated the mid-19th century clipping mill. This mill freed girls as young as 8 years old from hand clipping and made them available for schooling. It later became a lace mill. The first borough charter was granted in 1490 and allowed the inhabitants to buy and sell all manner of goods and encouraged trades and crafts to flourish. Craftsmen guarded their privileges jealously. Above towards the ironmongers at the cross can still be seen the insignia of the old stonemason's craft. Industry in Newmilns suffered from the union with England because of cheap imports, but picked up with the expansion of linen weaving, and this impressive council house, with steeple, bell and double forestair, could be afforded by 1739. Council meetings were held upstairs, while malefactors were imprisoned in the toll booth on the ground floor. That the town was by then prospering can be gathered, for example, by the introduction of the trades races in 1743. This shows that recreational pursuits were now officially sanctioned. With fees of 1 shilling sterling, entry was not cheap. They continued to be held on the town green until after the erection of the railway viaduct, when compensation from the railway company paid for the public park at Dulfhatswood. The second half of the 18th century continued to be prosperous, with silk and then, more importantly, cotton being woven in the town. By the end of the century, there were almost 300 weavers, and the population had risen to around 1,000. We now had a proud and thriving little town, although the area containing borough property consisted mainly of the land between the river and the road, from the Brig End to Greenhead. When the borough was set up in 1490, Newmilns would have consisted of a few corn mills on the river and a group of houses around the cross. By 1800, the town had a population of about 1,000, which was still confined to the area between the fords at East and West Strands, as it had been for most of its first 300 years as a borough. A time of rapid growth, however, was about to start. The next 60 years saw an expansion of the town with up to 1,000 handlooms working, with a population of 3,000, and much of the town looking substantially as it does today. By 1860, building on the main road had extended in the east to Isles Street and in the west to Kilholm Street. Doitburn Street and Grey Street had extended to High Street. By then, High Street had been built up as far as the Winnockland Brae. Back Street, which is now called King Street, was being established, as well as Union Street. Greenhead also was being built up. So too were Castle Street and Drygate Street. Expansion across the river into Greenholm had begun, and the period of rapid expansion was in the last quarter of the century, and continued up till the First World War. Kilholm Street continued to Loudoun Road, with the villas of the new middle classes at the West End. Adjoining streets like Shields Road and Riverbank Street were erected. Muir Place was built at the west end of Loudoun Road. Other areas taken over by the newly affluent included Darvel Road and Aston Pupple, as well as the top of the Boar Brae. It appeared that all vacant ground not occupied by lace mills was being taken over for housing, and this included the south bank of the river as far as the Strath. The population jumped to 4,000 by the turn of the century, and was at its peak of almost 5,000 by the First War. Already, building was taking place on sites which hardly seemed suitable because of their steepness, such as Hillside Place and Drygate Head. Baldysbrae still looks precarious. Housing development since the First War has been to improve the housing stock rather than to cope with an increase in population, which has in fact declined. Most building has been by the local council and was mainly carried out between the wars. Small developments were followed by a fairly large scheme at Gilfoot. An interesting note concerning Gilfoot is that electric lamp standards were erected for street lighting before a power supply was available, and, as an interim measure, lanterns were hung on the lamp posts. This was thought to give an oriental appearance, and the scheme became known as Shanghai. This name stuck for many years, but is being forgotten now that there are so many immigrant tenants. After the war, another housing scheme was built across the road from Gilfoot at Mason's Home. Prefabs were erected at the Strath, at Persian Sands and Mill Crescent. All were later replaced by permanent housing. Other council buildings since the war consisted mainly of filling gap sites, and there has been none since the demise of the old borough. Private building in the last 60 years has consisted of a scheme at the top of the Boar Brae, and some very small developments, including single houses. The first proper parish school in Newmilns started up in 1781, where the present church hall stands. Within 10 years, it could attract up to 90 pupils. It remained functioning until 1872, when overcrowding resulted in the need for more facilities. This plaque reminds us of where the school stood. A new school called the Victoria School was set up by Miss Martha Brown of Lunfeen and opened in Union Street in 1860. By 1882, a progressive teacher, Archibald Hood, had started classes for 3-year-olds at twopence a month, as well as evening classes. By then, the school roll was almost 300. By this time, too, a girls' school called Lady Flora's was built, in memory of a daughter of the Countess of Loudoun, who had been tragically defamed by Queen Victoria. This school was in operation until 1919, when the girls transferred to the public school. From 1921 until 1981, the building was used as a women's institute, and then was allowed to fall into disrepair. Fortunately, it has recently been converted into sheltered housing, with the frontage retained to preserve its character. Meanwhile, Loudoun School Board had opened their new public school in High Street in 1894. This was a magnificent structure designed by a local genius, John Mackintosh. At its opening, the roll was about 500 pupils, with a further 200 then at Lady Flora's. The best known head teacher at the school was Robert Patterson, better known as Big Bob, a Newmilns man who was in charge from 1923 until 1954. During his period as headmaster, many pupils considered Newmilns to have the best higher grade school in the country, and he also managed to impart a pride in the town. There were few frills, but no child left school without the knowledge required to thrive in the big world. In the 1930s, the school brought out a very well-produced magazine. Sadly, this handsome building was destroyed by fire in 1960, and the site mysteriously remains unused. A new primary school was opened in 1964. Neglecting the obvious site in High Street, this was built on the main road at the west end of the town, close to the workings at the new pit, with the ground liable to flooding as well as subsidence. In addition, this poorly designed eyesore was never large enough, and almost from the start, wooden huts have accommodated many of the children. Since primary education alone is now provided in the town, children have to continue their education elsewhere. A secondary school was built for Valley children in 1971. Again the High Street site was ignored and the school building erected on the main Galston to Glasgow road. This is another unattractive building, erected with no apparent thoughts for road safety. The oldest remaining church building in Loudoun parish is at Loudoun Kirk, of which only the choir remains. It was erected in 1451 with money donated by Alicia Campbell in memory of her husband John Campbell of Wester Loudoun. It is still used occasionally for burials, and recently an organisation called the Friends of Loudoun Kirk has been set up to preserve what is left of the building and also the grounds. Incidentally, it was used as a place of outdoor worship by the SAS, who trained at Loudoun in 1944, and a service was held there in 1994 in honour of their Belgian members. In 1494, among the 30 persons known as the Lollards of Kyle, who were summoned by the Archbishop of Glasgow to answer to James IV on charges of treason, was John Campbell of Newmilns, whose home may have been on the site of the fortified tower on Castle Street. This building was used for a variety of purposes over the years, including a grain store and a beer cellar. It was allowed to fall into disrepair, but has recently been rescued and renovated and rented out as a dwelling house. Another Newmilns Lollard undertook to translate the New Testament and part of the Old into Scots. This was a farmer, Murdoch Nisbet of Hart Hill, which lay in what became Loudoun Glebe. Forced to flee abroad to avoid persecution as a heretic, he completed his work around 1520 and brought it back to Scotland. He more or less remained in hiding until the Reformation in 1560. Unfortunately, the early fathers of the Reformed Church, such as John Knox, preferred the English version of the Bible, or our good Scots tongue may still have been the official language of the state. Murdoch's book remained in the family for over 2 centuries. It was then in the hands of the Boswells of Auchinleck from 1745 until 1893, and to the shame and discredit of all concerned, it now languishes in the British Library in London. At present, there are proposals locally for its return, and it would be a scandal if the demands were not met. With the growth of the borough, Loudoun Kirk was considered to be too far from the bulk of the population in the parish, and a church was built on Main Street in 1633. The most violent religious times soon followed, with the imposition of an episcopal form of worship by the now Anglified Stuart kings. Two ministers in Newmilns, James Gregg and John Nevy, were forced out of their charges for non-acceptance of the authority of bishops. Nevy died in exile in Holland in 1684. He had been one of the four ministers appointed by the General Assembly in 1647 to revise the metrical psalms. He is supposedly responsible for the final 30. Newmilns was at the centre of the resistance movement of the Covenanters in the 17th century killing times. The most famous Covenanter locally was John Nisbet of Harthill, a direct descendant of Murdoch Nisbet. He led the local Covenanters at the Battle of Drumclog. He was later wounded and captured and executed in Edinburgh. His captors were a troop of dragoons led by his cousin, also John Nisbet. Another relative, John Nisbet from the Glen, was executed at Kilmarnock Cross in 1683, where a plaque marks the spot. Yet another Nisbet, James of Highside, was captured while attending the funeral of another local martyr, John Richmond of Now, and executed in Glasgow. Near the present Dykescroft farm at Little Blackwood, the farmer James White was killed near the Pulbaith burn. His head was cut off and taken to Newmilns, where it was used as a football in the town green. The fate of James White's head was referred to by the Ettrick shepherd James Hogg in the verse: "Till oot come the wee grey moudywart, beneath the hollow stane, and it howkit a grave for the all grey heed, for the heed grew a' alane." Eight fellow worshippers were captured and taken to Newmilns for execution. The bailies convinced the soldiers to observe procedures, and the prisoners were lodged in the old keep in Castle Street. John Browning from Linfeen led a night raid on the keep, and the prisoners were set free, but only at the cost of the life of one of their rescuers, John Law. Memorials to the Covenanters abound locally, and there are many in the parish churchyard. The parish church was replaced in 1738 by another built on or near the same site. George Laurie served as parish minister for 30 years, from 1763, and frequently entertained Robert Burns at the manse on St Margaret's Mount. He discouraged the poet from emigrating by introducing him to his literary contacts in Edinburgh after the publication of the Kilmarnock edition. Again, religious differences led to the secessionists objecting to the imposition of ministers on congregations, and many Newmilns Christians worshipped in Kilmores. In 1773, the Secession Church built a meeting house in High Street. A larger building was built behind it to replace it in 1833, and this was used for worship until 1961. It had come into union with the established church in 1929, when it became known as Newmilns West Church. By 1844, the parish church was known as the Wee Kirk, when the present church, the Big Kirk, was built around it. The foundation stone was laid in true Masonic style, and an address given by the chaplain to the lodge, George Laurie, minister at Moncton and author of He Ye Mine o Lang Lang Syne. Once more, when congregations were refused the power of veto over the appointment of ministers, the Free Church was set up in 1846. Their first services were held in the Sun Inn, and the foundation stone of the Free Kirk, or Loudoun East Church as it came to be known, was laid in King Street at the foot of the Winnickland Brae in 1846. The church closed in 1980 and the building demolished in 1986. Proudly displayed in Loudoun Parish Church is the flag of the USA. The blockading of southern ports during the American Civil War created hardship in Newmilns owing to the shortage of cotton. Despite this, the weavers fully supported the northern cause and the abolition of slavery. Acknowledgement came in the form of a flag, carried to Newmilns by an emissary of Abraham Lincoln. The present flag is the second replacement given to the town by the American authorities. Other Christian denominations have contributed to the Christian life of the community, and it is pleasing to see the Plymouth Brethren for many years in Drygate Street, prospering sufficiently to erect an imposing new hall on Main Street in 1994. Weaving has been the staple industry in Newmilns for several centuries. The Irvine water provided motive power before the use of steam and later electricity became available. Since then, the high humidity near the river has been useful in controlling the tension of the fibres. The first power loom in the valley to use a steam engine was built on a greenfield site in Greenholm in 1867. It manufactured wincey cloth, a mixture of cotton and woolen fibres. The factory was later extended to manufacture lace, madras, chenille and tapestry. Operating as Hood Morton and Company, it is still in production. Within 10 years, a further 8 companies were in production, employing around 1,500 people, and eventually there were 14 factories in the town, most of them in Greenholm. The introduction of the Nottingham lace machine in the 1870s and the Madras power loom in the 1880s brought a great prosperity to the town, and this continued until the First World War. There was a mini boom during the Second War with the manufacture of camouflage and mosquito netting, but the story has generally been one of decline. Those with the foresight to invest in the new technology rapidly made their fortunes, as with the skills of the old handloom weavers applied to the new trade, the valley soon surpassed its southern competitors in quality and output. The trade has given employment to whole families, some for several generations. Other associated firms included a small workshop in Stonygate Road, which produced punched cards for pattern weaving until about 1970. The use of synthetic fibres during the 1950s did help to slow the decline, but at present only 5 companies are still producing curtains and associated commodities. The death of the textile industry in Newmilns has often been forecast, but it looks set to continue well into the new millennium. The Lanfine bleaching and finishing works opened in 1883 at the bottom of Brown Street. This firm provided some housing for its workers and also tennis courts and a bowling green across the road. The clubhouse is now a factory shop. The bleach field was burnt down in 1945 and the houses demolished in the 1960s. This site is once again an industrial part of the town and includes this firm which manufactures cooling equipment. Water Miser sells in all markets where water cooling is required. Also on the site is part of the Vesuvius Crucible Company, which is now the major employer in the town. It occupies much of Brown Street from the railway station westwards, including much of the old goods yards. Vesuvius manufactures refractory ceramics, and a major customer is British Steel. Another enterprise providing badly needed jobs in the town occupies the old lace works of Pollock and Ling and manufactures automatic linkers. Famco linkers are used at home and abroad in the manufacture of sausages. Ego Heat is a light engineering firm with premises in Brown Street. It specialises in sheet metal working, as well as providing heating and ventilation systems. Although sitting on the edge of the Ayrshire coalfield, very little mining took place in Newmilns. Along with a few manganese or drift mines, the deep coal extraction was from the new pit at Gilfoot. This ran briefly in the 1920s. The coal ran across to the station on a tramway locally known as the Bogie Line. This is no longer evident since the construction of the football pitches at Gilfoot, the houses at Mason's Home, and the removal of the underpass where it crossed the main road. A successful enterprise in the town has been Ald's, now Gilmer's Dairy at the Toonhead, which has extended to cater for much of Ayrshire, with premises also at Kilmarnock and elsewhere. Another dairy, Willowbank, is interesting, as it was an operational farm until quite recently, although in the middle of the town. An early leisure activity already mentioned was the trades races, which lasted for almost 300 years. After 1901, they were moved to the new Isles Public Park, which had been purchased with the compensation money paid for the destruction of the town green by the erection of the viaduct. The location of the Isles Park, practically across from the Norrell Burn from its predecessor at Hill Head, meant that footballers had at least half a mile to walk for a game. This tradition was maintained with the West End Park at Mason's Home. Despite this, Newmilns had a senior football team. Their most famous player was Hugh Wilson, who gained his first cap for Scotland while still playing for Newmilns. Newmilns weavers took the game to such places as Barcelona and Gothenburg. The seniors disbanded in the 1890s, while the juniors survived until the First War. The park at Gilfoot plays host to local amateur teams. Currently, Newmilns has a successful team who are Ayrshire League champions, as well as the holders of the West of Scotland Cup. The pavilion at Gilfoot is becoming something of a social asset to the west end of the town. George Laurie may have had mine o' sliding about the curlers' rinks at the Miller's Dam, but it is a long time since curling took place either here or on the various shallow ponds built for that purpose, although it was once a popular winter pastime. One old sport which has managed to survive is that of golf. The world's only golf club at Loudoun was not founded until the start of this century, but the game has been played here on what was known as the Golf Park for at least 400 years. It is reputed that the ground now covered by the course has never been under the plough. Another survivor is Newmilns Bowling Club, which has been in operation here in Nelson Street since 1862, on land granted by the Browns of Linfeen. It has been the town's only green since the demise of the one at the Bleachfield. The erection of the new pavilion in the 1920s and its extensions since the 1960s have contributed to the maintenance of the popularity of the game in the town. A popular game early in the century, tennis was played at Lady Flora's, the Bleachfield, Gowan Bank and here at Persian Sands, but the courts are long gone. The coming of the railway made it easier to organise races for homing pigeons, and there were a great many dew men in the town. The local society meets in the Jimison Park Pavilion, where the birds are banded for the next day's race. The birds are now transported by road. Another continuing sport which is still enjoyed, although less popular than in its heyday, is fishing. This building on the river's edge at Craigview Road housed Newmilns Angling Club's trout hatchery, which was used from the 1940s until 1974, with up to 80,000 young fish being released into the river annually. In the 1880s, cycling was also a very popular activity with the local clubs and their penny farthings. The Newmilns sharpshooters practised their skills at Dalwhatswood Rifle Range or at the targets across the burn from the public park. A more modern outdoor pursuit which is now available in the town, is the dry ski slope, which is sited in the All-Store Park off High Street. Established in 1833 and more or less the oldest brass band in Scotland still playing, the Borough has been very successful at times over the years. It is still going strong, although now called Newmilns and Galston Band. The Stute in its early years was used by many local groups such as the Templars, Rechabites and choral societies. It was, however, best known as a billiards hall until television and lack of demand killed the game off. Around the middle of the 19th century, there were 15 well-patronised hotels or public houses. Now there are but 4. Drumlashin was the nickname of the railway hotel, as it stands opposite the Royal Bank building, known locally as Brodick Castle. The inn is now called the Riverside. This hotel has long been a fixture at the Brig End corner, as has the Crown Hotel at the Toonhead. The Loudoun Arms is probably the finest 18th century building still in use locally. The most popular form of entertainment for much of the 20th century was the cine, first here at the Picture House, which was built in 1913 between Main Street and the Puddock Dub. It ran until the 1940s. The Rex was built on the site of the Cross Keys Inn and opened in 1939 under the ownership of the Young family, who also had the Picture House. It was a classy, comfortable theatre and survived longer than many, but the last film was shown in 1986. The Morton Hall has recently been renovated. The old chambers where the council met is now the fitness room and is well supplied with equipment. The halls are utilised by a wide variety of local organisations. Loudoun parish runs from Loudoun Hill for about 9 miles along the north bank of the River Irvine to about a mile west of Galston. At that point it is about 3 miles in depth. At its deepest, where it runs towards Eaglesham, it is about 7 miles. Early signs of human habitation can be found with a prehistoric burial cairn at the approach to the 7th Green at Loudoun Golf Club, as well as several sites close to Loudoun Hill. The next known inhabitants were invading Romans, who built a fort in this area. The first named characters we know of were a James de Lambinus and his son James de Loudoun, who had the barony of Loudoun around 1100, when the feudal system was being introduced by Norman proteges of the Scottish kings. Where he lived we cannot know, but there is evidence of a motte and bailey castle about half a mile north of Woodhead, and a more imposing structure on a hill about 100 yards west of the same farm. The most famous descendant of this James de Loudoun was his great-great-grandson William Wallace, the Scottish patriot. The present Loudoun Castle was the principal home of the Loudoun family from about 1400, although it was thoroughly rebuilt in the 17th century, and the final major phase of building was finished in 1811. Tradition suggests there had been a building of some sort on the site for a very long period. The old yew tree at the south wall is said to be around 1200 years old and would have been planted to provide material for bowmen. It is reputed that articles of the Treaty of Union were drafted under the yew tree in 1707. John, the fourth Earl, was appointed Governor of Virginia, and the name is preserved in North America, with the village of Fort Loudoun in Pennsylvania and Loudoun Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland. While the fourth Earl may not have been a successful soldier, he is credited with many improvements at home. In particular, the planting of over 1 million trees, many brought from North America, later allowed Robert Tannahill to write of Loudoun's bonny woods and braes. With the acquisition of the temple lands of Darvel at the Reformation, the parish boundaries were set much as they are today, and apart from Newmilns Borough, were mostly under the ownership of the Earl of Loudoun. Earl John was responsible for the building of the first modern roads in the parish, including the first road to be built in Ayrshire using statute labour. This ran from his castle to his home in Newmilns. At this time also, farming was revolutionised, with the change from the run-rig system to one of enclosure. This needed larger farms, and many of the farmhouses we see today date from this time. The availability of both coal and lime on the estate allowed the construction of lime kilns and the treatment of the local acid soils. Apart from Newmilns and Darvel, other small centres of population survived for a long time. The chief among these was the Loudoun, or Alton, about half a mile north of Loudoun Castle. Although the name survives only in the farm across the road, there was once a thriving clachan. Around 1850, 25 families lived at the Alton, where there was a long-established coal mine. It had its own school and tradesmen. Even in the 1920s, there were still 10 family houses, together with a blacksmith's and a joiner's, which survived until the Second War. Open cast mining was briefly carried out in the 1980s. Over the centuries, relations between the burghers of Newmilns and the Loudoun family have generally been good, but this was not the case with Lord Donington at the end of the 19th century. Repeated attempts to block the public right-of-way along the Lime Road and the removal of the barriers by Newmilns weavers finally ended with a victory for the Newmilns folk in court in 1893. The power and influence of the Loudons diminished over the years, as happened to most landed gentry. But an accelerating factor was the ninth Earl, who squandered most of the family fortune in the late 19th century, mainly in backing slow race horses. The largest single disposal of property was in 1921, when 45 farms and 37 grazings were auctioned, as well as a large number of cottages, including those at Hungry Hill, Ladyton, Loudoun Kirk and the Alton. Most of the farms were bought by their tenants. A typical example is West Newton or Nitton, where Arthur Smith probably paid around £3,000 for the farm which has been in the family since 1898. The present owner is his grandson, also Arthur Smith. At that time, apart from dairy cattle, there were also pigs, hens and horses on the farm. Income would be generated also from shooting and tree harvesting, as well as cash crops such as potatoes, turnips and cereals. Today, local farms are mainly concerned with beef and dairy cattle, with sheep being raised on more marginal land. Farming economics have compelled most farms to expand by the acquisition of such land as becomes available. Occasionally, some quite exotic visitors can be seen at some farms. Others have encouraged visitors who may not be quite so exotic, but provide a welcome source of income, as here at Loudoun Mains. The castle was rendered uninhabitable following a fire in 1941, and it and the remaining properties were finally disposed of in 1993. There is now a fun fair on the site. Below the castle and next to the golf course is a sports complex, which includes a golf driving range and artificial football pitches. By all accounts, the burghers of Newmilns, and the weavers in particular, always showed an independent spirit, which embraced the latest radical ideas. With this grew a feeling of belonging and a common purpose. The Chartist movement had a large support in the 1840s and maintained a provision store with 248 members. This reappeared in 1856 as the Cooperative Society, which seemed to provide for all the needs of the people and looked set to go on forever. Sadly, the co-op in Newmilns is little more than a memory, and its once proud buildings a source of shame in the town. An even earlier social group was the Freemasons, who have been active in the town since 1747. Their most illustrious visitor and honorary member was Robert Burns. Newmilns was also early in establishing a funeral society, a farmers' fire insurance scheme and a subscription library. When the town council till 1975 ran this library in Craigview Road, it was one of only two in the county provided by a small borough. Newmilns became a police borough in 1834 and extended over the river into Greenholm in 1872. By the end of the century, the people enjoyed a high standard of living in the town of Light and Leading. It was said there were two of everything, and to some extent this was so. For a start, there were two councils for over 70 years, as the old council refused to accept the new, and continued to meet in the old Toon House, with the new eventually using the Morton Hall from its erection in 1896. Probably the most amusing two of everything are the coats of arms. There would have been a borough seal since 1490, but this was adopted in 1892 and appears to have been used without authority until 1951, when this new seal was approved. When the new gas company commenced production in 1872 from its works at Hillside, it was in competition with an older company which had started up in 1845. Both companies were taken over by the town council, and Hillside Works was in production until the arrival of North Sea Gas. The site is now occupied by Covenanters Court. The earlier gasworks had operated in the area which became the town's yard off King Street. This area also contained the slaughterhouse. Newmilns also has two handsome stone bridges over the river, both close to the original fords at East and West Strands. The Institute Bridge on Craigview Road was built around 1840 to give access to Browns Road and Glenfean. The bridge at the top of Brown Street is the latest of several stone structures which have been there since 1600 at least. The present bridge was built in 1881 and rebuilt following the 1920 flood. When factory building began in Greenholm, the first footbridges were built to allow employees quicker access to their places of work. The first to be built was the Iron Brig on Nelson Street. We now also have the Jubilee Bridge at Shields Road, Steele's Brig at Muir Place, the Mill Steps Brig at Mill Road, and the most recent one at Mason's Home. They also have suffered from floods. Another pair is the two bank buildings. The Clydesdale Bank has long occupied what was originally the Black Bull Hotel on Main Street. This building still houses the Royal Bank of Scotland. The attached dwelling contains stained glass windows depicting famous Scottish poets: James Hogg, Walter Scott, Alan Ramsay, Robert Tannahill and Robert Burns. The town used to be able to boast of 2 printers, but now M&W Walkers exists as a newsagent, as does J.H. Green, better known as Greensies, which produced the badly missed Irvine Valley News. The arrival of the railway in 1845 was a major factor in the town's expansion, as it brought the outside world closer and made markets more easily accessible. It took until 1896 before this was extended to Darvel, and it was a large engineering undertaking. The construction of the viaduct and the rerouting of the main road with the excavation of the Catataston Papel were major tasks, but the building of the retaining wall at the Craig was the most difficult. The wall is 34 feet high and up to 30 feet deep. Now a dwelling house, this used to be the police office, when there was a sergeant and several constables in the town. The cells were to the back. A well-remembered policeman is Wally Harper, who was famous for his "Put out that licht" during the blackout. We now only have this shop front at the Brig End, where we can hopefully contact the police. Another service very much appreciated is provided from this surgery on Loudoun Road. The people of Newmilns consider themselves to be fortunate in the standards of care provided by the doctors and other staff based here, particularly in the quality of the emergency call-out service, which is almost unique in the county. The all-men's cabin was paid for by public subscription in 1930 and extended in 1985. It is still in operation and popular now with both sexes. A 100 years ago, the town seemed to be full of small shops and enterprises. It appeared that every second house in Brown Street sold some sort of merchandise or service. Many people showed enterprise in the variety of their products. Wallace and Torrance, joiner and undertaker, also sold household furnishings as well as wirelesses and gramophone records. And next door, Granny Torrance had her wee shop where 14 Paris biscuits cost a penny. Now there is only Tom Campbell the butcher at the Brig End and the post office. The same was true of all the streets in the town, but now there are hardly any shops off the main road and very few there. Those that remain continue to provide a much needed service as well as supplying a focus for the social life of the town. The commercial hotel was built in 1869 to accommodate the large number of business visitors. Finally, it was briefly known as the Covenanters, but lay empty for many years until 1997, when it was converted to private housing. Two services no longer provided locally were both in Brown Street and catered for the valley. The Baroo or Unemployment Exchange and the National Insurance Office ceased to function around 1970. An earlier casualty was the parish office, best known for dispensing tackety bits. It became the doctor's surgery and is now a dwelling house. One service which has been retained is the voluntary fire service. It has had several homes and is now at the west end of the town. The firemen used to be kept busy with the large number of thatched houses. Lace factories have also had their fair share of fires. Stuart Moir and Muirs was never rebuilt, and the area is still known as the Burnt Mill. Recent casualties have included empty mills at the top of the town, namely Henderson Morton Ingalls and J. Muirs. Halls in the town have fared no better, with the Boys' Club Hall, later the Sea Cadet Hall in Nelson Street, being destroyed by fire in the 1960s. Much later, the British Legion Club, previously the Hebron Hall at Greenside, suffered the same fate. Apart from fires, floods have required the services of the fire brigade. Usually occurring with the normal heavy rainfall in August, they are referred to as the Lammas floods. Two in particular are well remembered. The 1920 flood caused damage throughout the town, but is mostly remembered for the damage at Kilholm Street, where much of the main road was washed away. In 1954, a landslide at the town scout on the Norrell Burn at the public park caused a 50-yard wide, 10-foot high wall of mud containing debris such as tree trunks, dead animals and domestic refuse to roll down the Darvel road. Damage was extensive, with material being deposited from the main road to the river, as far down as the cross. Newmilns is justifiably proud of its firemen, who respond quickly to call-outs. Training exercises such as this keeps them up to date and in tip-top condition. Small boroughs like Newmilns appear to have been well served when there was a town council of 12 unpaid councillors who lived and usually worked in the town and were well known. Here the local councillors are setting off on their annual inspection of the Loudoun Hill waterworks. They certainly took a pride in the town and in their achievements. For about 100 years they managed the affairs of the town, with the county council being responsible for larger matters such as roads and education. Typical of the men who successfully ran the town is our last provost, John White. With the new local government set up, we have a council which covers an area from Loudoun to beyond Dalmellington, and the proposed assembly in Edinburgh will assume control of some local functions. This surely is a factor in the decline of the town and the apathy which has been evident for many years. Recently, our council has taken to painting pretty patterns on the roads and providing chicanes for budding racing drivers. Some signs of improvement are now, however, evident. Lady Flora's has been tastefully renovated and now contains sheltered housing. The keep has been restored and is now occupied. The townhouse and the cross generally have seen refurbishment. Perhaps the town may prosper after all during its next 500 years.